Good day, colleagues. Welcome back to an exciting session of our program here on Foresight for Systems Transformation. We're going to get started quite shortly here. We've got a few people still coming in the room. Great to see you on the call. Hi, Sandor. Good to see you back. Yadi, good to see you as well. Looking forward to the discussion. Anga, great to see you. We'll get started in just a minute. We are, of course, in a 1-hour Change Leaders webinar today, really an opportunity to pause and reflect and learn from some individuals leading really exciting foresight work, some foresight practice. And so I'm going to introduce you to them in a minute. Before we get going, I'm wondering how it's going with all of you with your foresight experiments. Earlier in the week, we had an opportunity to share some template information with you, Johan and I. I wonder if any of you have had a chance to work on that template, maybe apply that to your foresight experiments. And then just a reminder that during the course of next week, we're building up to our second foresight clinic. So if you have some practical application questions about methods, how you might use them in the context of your foresight experiment, the clinic will be a key opportunity to do that. And so you might want to start getting your questions ready and preparing yourself for that. Thank you. I see Delphine is sharing the experiment template in the chat. And so feel free to grab a hold of that copy and go get your work done on your foresight experiment. So today I'm very pleased to invite two of my own colleagues that work in the foresight space. They've interacted with some of our friends at SWAF, but they've really for the last few years been doing some really interesting foresight work in Africa. And I'm going to introduce you to that project and talk a little bit about the project. Let me first start by talking about who these colleagues are. And in fact, my slide's gone the wrong direction. Let me change directions there. So first of all, Dr. Tara Polzer Ngwato, she's with an organization called Social Surveys Africa, does extensive work in South Africa, particularly at the policy level, doing research on the national level, looking at what's going on in the society. I'll invite her to say a couple of sentences about her work a little bit later. And then another colleague of Tara's, Xolelwa Kashe-Katya. Xolelwa is with an organization called the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. It's also known as MISTRA, which is an emerging, you could call it a think tank. It's somewhat of a, what should we call it, a thought leadership organization doing very interesting national research in South Africa. And of course, the two of them with a group, a much bigger group, are working on a foresight project called the Ndlulamiti Scenarios that's been going for quite a bit of time. I'm going to invite Tara, who I see is with us on the call. Tara, if you'd like to start, we might go a little bit back to front with you starting and Xolelwa coming in a bit later. But if you'd like to start and just give us a broad background about the Ndlulamiti project, some of the work that you're involved in, and then I'll have some questions for you as we go.
Hello, Marius. Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. It's, a really great opportunity to just talk a bit about our different contexts. So often we present to policy makers in South Africa, and it's all very much about the content and less about the design and what we're actually trying to achieve by using the methodology of scenarios and using the methodology of a barometer. So this is a really nice methodological opportunity to engage with colleagues and peers around the approach. And we really, really would love your questions and your comments, and we can always refine what we're doing. We're always looking for new ways of doing this. I do have a couple of slides I'm going to just show you because what I'm presenting about is a barometer, so it's visual. Before we get there, let me just introduce myself, I guess, a little bit more. Thank you, Marius. My own background is sort of multinational, American, German, studied in the UK, I've been in South Africa for 20 years. And I've always been multidisciplinary, so have always tried to sort of span micro level disciplines like anthropology through to macro level disciplines of political science, sociology, demographics, combining qualitative and quantitative, so storytelling, communication that really uses a full human being and emotions, as well as hard trends and data and understanding how they relate to each other. So that's been an interest of mine for a very long time. And one of the great things about this project, the Indulomiti project, is that it allows us to come together. So let me show some slides, if I may. Here we go. Okay. Let me just, too many things going on in this screen. So trying to find the right, here we go. All right, I hope everyone can see that. Is that visible?
We have it in edit mode. You may want to go bottom right. And there we are. It's now in presenter mode. Go ahead.
All right, brilliant. All right, so the Indulomiti Barometer is part of this larger Indulomiti presentation that I think you're going to hear about from Xolelwa. I'm hoping that she is on her way in. I think she was having some problems with the link, so I've just resent it to her. I'm going to check on that, Marius. So basically, this has been a project that was started in 2017 and then formally launched to the public in 2018. It is a scenarios project. I don't have to tell you what that means, obviously, for this group of people, but very much a long-term scenarios project for an entire country. So from 2017 at the time to 2030. And we're currently in the process of revising. Colleagues are currently in the process of revising those scenarios to 2035. So there's three scenario stories. One of the unique elements of this, or I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly unusual for a scenarios project, is that the storylines and the narratives of the scenarios have been accompanied by two kinds of monitoring and research and modeling. So the one is economic modeling that actually said, okay, if these multidimensional scenarios about the nature of South Africa as a country, as a cohesive or a non-cohesive social and political space, if these different scenarios were to come about, what would the economics look like? So we're not talking about that part today, but it is very interesting. The other part that we are talking about today is a barometer, and that's a sort of a monitoring and evaluation tool, essentially, which said, okay, we've told stories about the future in 2017. Now let's actually put together a tracking system with hard data inputs that tells us year by year which of these stories seems to be coming true, or if in fact a completely different story is coming true. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So what are the functions of a barometer? I think we all have a kind of picture in mind of, you know, a speed gauge or something like that. But why do we need something like this? So there's a couple of different functions that I think are really important. One is really to establish a shared picture. In this case, of a country's current tradition and condition and trajectory, but it's generally a shared picture of whatever the complex issue is that we're talking about. And what that does is it enables a conversation across sectors. So, you know, your economists can talk to your human rights people. Your labor union people can talk to your corporates. There's a whole range of ways in which people who usually don't talk to each other need a shared starting point that's empirical. What we also can do with a barometer is to establish a shared sense of urgency. And that in turn allows a sort of galvanization of collective action. You can see this is a bit of a theory of change. But at the same time, you need to simplify to generate these shared understandings of what's going on. But if you oversimplify, then it loses some of its ability to galvanize action again. So you need to retain enough nuance to inform the prioritization of action. So how do you do this? At a very level, you simplify. You simplify a multidimensional context. And you do that ideally, in this case, by using uncontested data. So you could generate a whole bunch of data yourself, but it's much better in this case to use data that nobody's going to be questioning. Through memorable and person-oriented visual storytelling. So you're simplifying how you're putting across the message. And you show the present status, but in relation to comparators, to targets. And this is where the scenario stories comes in, but also where you then say, well, in the South African case, it's not so easy. And in many countries, it isn't, right? Everybody wants to be unique. What do we reasonably compare ourselves to? Do we compare ourselves to the African average? Do we compare ourselves to the global average, to the mid-income average, to our neighboring, like who do we compare ourselves to? So there is some logic there. And then that you basically track a trajectory over time. So what is a design that allows you to do all of these things? If we can do this, what does it actually allow us to do? Sorry, I keep moving my little screen around here. So if a big part of what a barometer design is about is to enable collective action. And I think, in this course that you're doing, I don't know what centrality the enabling of collective action holds, but I'm hoping it's fairly central to what you're all trying to figure out collectively how to do. There are a range of very common barriers that I'm sure we've all experienced. So when you try to bring people together, there's competition for sectoral priorities, right? So is it economic growth? Is it unemployment? Is it environmental protection? So, often you can't even start having a conversation about what to do because each sector has a very different, or you can't even have a conversation about what the current status is from which to depart because each sector has its own priorities. A second common barrier is techno-speak, data overload, 120 slide presentations, lots of graphs, lots of tables, and the vast majority of your multiplicity of audiences will just get lost. They won't understand, they'll emotionally disengage, get lost in the detail. Somebody goes back and wants to know something about slide 52 and you've lost the conversation. A simple part of that as well is then that you get a disconnect between the technocrats and professionals who can engage with the material and the public who can't, which we're trying to avoid in our barometer. What you also get on the other side is that if you don't have a continuous data flow of some kind, there's a loss of interest in the story, in the scenarios, right? The limited number of times in which you can publish the same newspaper article or bring something up if there isn't new information to hang it onto. But also if there's too much new data, then it just gets, again, the story gets lost. And then the final point, I'm sure there's many more you could think of, is that if you have just a very simple story that says it's all going wrong, then you get emotional overwhelm, and that's also a barrier to action if you don't have directions towards action built into what you're trying to communicate. All right. I thought that Xolelwa would be presenting this, but I mean, essentially, these are the...
Tara, I see Xolelwa is here, so we might take a detour and come back to the rest of the barometer after she's inputted, but go ahead and conclude.
I actually think that might be a good idea because I do think that it doesn't make that much sense to show the barometer if there isn't some understanding of where it comes from. So, Xolelwa, if you're happy with that, then I'd actually rather hand over to you and then come back afterwards.
Thank you, Tara. So I'm going to take a moment just to backtrack and introduce Xolelwa, and just one or two framing remarks. So let me quickly replace the screen there. So colleagues, just to take a big step back to the big picture for a moment before I welcome Xolelwa. As mentioned by Tara already, we're sharing with you a little bit today about a project called the Ngwato scenarios. You'll notice there on that cover of that report from 2019, it has an image of a giraffe, or a couple of giraffe actually in the wild. And the name Ngwato really comes from an African language called the Nguni language. and it means to look above the trees, as a giraffe would look above the trees. And so the idea was, can we use foresight as a means to get South African society to look above the trees, to get out from, within the news cycle and the internal debates, and take a longer term view of where the national future is going. I want to show you one other page, or a couple of other pages in this report before I welcome Xolelwa. We're obviously talking about the methods of doing foresight. And what's interesting about this particular project is that the sponsors and supporters of the project weren't a single business or a government department or an NGO. It really was a cross-section of a range of different organizations, which in and of itself is interesting, and was structured to be led by a steering committee, which is made up of, if you knew who those suspects are, that are made up and drawn from across society, various different sectors of society, corporate, government, civil society, which was then supported by what we describe as a leadership group, which similarly is a very diverse sort of society-wide brains trust. And then the rigorous work that underpinned that was really done by a whole list of researchers from very different backgrounds. Now, what I'm inviting Xolelwa to do is tell us a little bit about the story of Ngwato and where the project got to in terms of its foresight and its scenarios, and then we'll loop back to Tara, if that's okay, to unpack the barometer for us a little bit. So, Xolelwa, in your absence, I have mentioned Mistra, and it's great to have you on the call. Let me hand over to you to make some opening remarks.
Hi. Thank you, Marius, for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for my delayed submission or joining of this meeting. I'm just having a bit of a technical challenge. I'm using different gadgets, and I think technology is failing me today. But I think while I'm busy trying to load my slides, I'll just start by introducing myself first. I'm Xolelwa Kashe-Katya. I work for an organization called Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. I am also a member of the steerco of Ngwato, which is the same body that Marius and also Tara sit in. And Mapungubwe as an institute is a research institute, otherwise, others would refer to it as a think tank. And what we do is to conduct, research that has a long-term view to it, but also to ensure that the solutions that are proposed, also there's a long view to it, so that we can have more long-term strategies. We're established as a response to the short-termism that seems to be endemic, in particular in the South African state, and how it responds to challenges facing the country. So for us, it made sense to be a part of Ngwato collective, because we're also, just like Gibbs colleagues, we are also working on long-term view, building scenarios and so on. So, the background to this was back in 2017, when there was a whole lot of challenges that were facing the country. There was this idea that something needs to be done, but at the same time, while we were thinking that, we had people at Gibbs, and there was also others in business, Anglo-American, and so on. We're also concerned with the issues that were happening then. Those who follow South African news will know that there was a fallism movement that was taking shape in the country. And, it was first Rhodes must fall, fees must fall, up to a point where even there was a call for the president of the country to fall, Zuma must fall movement. So we thought, as a country, because we are used to scenarios, the transition, South Africa's transition to democracy was informed by was informed by scenarios building exercise that is we had then at that time on Fleur scenarios. So we thought that could be the most tenable way of addressing the issues without really, again, adopting a short-term strategy that will not have lasting solutions. So through that engagement, that's when then it was decided that Indlulamiti SA scenarios should then be established. I mean, we had no support at that time. I heard Marius talking about business and also other stakeholders supporting it. But when we started, I mean, we did not even have an idea how we were going to fund the project. But we started anyways because there was a need in the country to do something more meaningful. And it all started with the research process. I'm just trying to load my slides, Marius, and so just please bear with me. But I'll just give a bit of that story. Those who know other scenarios that took place in the country beyond the Mount Fleur scenarios, which informed the transition of South Africa from apartheid to a democratic dispensation, will know that there were other interventions that followed that. There was Dinokeng scenarios, but also we had the presidential scenarios that were built, I think it was during the time just before President Thabo Mbeki was removed from office. And unfortunately, those scenarios were never, really adopted or, or adopted by the state or even publicized as such. So what then happened is that when we started ours, we felt that there was a need to come up with something that's slightly different from other interventions, which then entailed that we would actually go out on a roadshow. We would engage with various sectors of our society. So not only did we, okay, I see something on the, oh, okay. So sorry, Marius.
I thought I'd share from what I have in my records.
You share, okay, while I'm still struggling with mine. I've been using Teams a lot, so now I'm a bit rusty when it comes to Zoom in terms of screen sharing. But I mean, the partners that we had, as you can see in Marius's screen as well, the screen that he shared, were drawn from various stakeholders. We had also partnered with, other, those who are familiar with ADRS, that is an entity that's based in the US. They're also doing economic modeling. And then there's social surveys, which is Tara and her colleagues who are doing the barometer. So we felt that instead of just building the scenarios, we would actually incorporate that. But the normal course of scenarios building that I'm sure Marius has shared with you, in terms of the course, because I understand that this is a course or something to that effect, but it's the normal course of scenarios. Marius, I don't know if you've got any of the older slides, because I can see the slides on my side, because now I really need to get into the, the meat of it without really telling the background story.
Is there a particular slide that you're looking for, Xolelwa?
I think the one that shows the whole process of building the scenarios.
Let me see what I
not
do have.
Not the latest one. Please, apologies, colleagues.
So what might be worthwhile, and what I can share, and that we will share with the delegates afterwards, is to walk through the scenarios report in a sense, and then we'll share the detailed version of.
Or maybe the report would help. The report will help because those slides speak to the report. Okay, so that is a bit of the background there. As you can see, there's some notable personalities there. But I think the main thing is that if you can hold on to that slide, what informed the process was arriving at the key question. And I mean, after a lot of debate around what the key question would be, we felt that actually what we needed to settle on was this idea of social cohesion, because whether we're talking about the economy or whether we're talking about labor issues or unemployment, there was this sense of lack of cohesiveness in South Africa. Within the labor movement, we cannot find each other across racial lines, class, and so on. So we felt that the key question should actually have at its heart the term social cohesion. But then we also needed to establish a horizon, and we chose 2030 because 2030 is actually the same horizon as the National Development Plan, but also the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which would be most relevant for this conversation. So we thought, even though the NDP is highly contested in South Africa, and even if the state were maybe or a new government were to do away with it, we still have the SDGs that have a horizon at 2030. So that's what we were working with at that time. And we also needed to unpack social cohesion, because there is this tendency to think of social cohesion as just getting along, or a moment of kumbaya after we've won the Rugby World Cup. But we had to unpack it, and we had to actually look at, you know, the meaning of social cohesion in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of how, you know, we consult, you know, how across the spectrum in the country, how inclusive is that consultation, how included do members of society feel in terms of the economy, in terms of society at large, because there's still this idea that there are those who are not part of, you know, the nation, this, well, literally two nations in one. If we can move on, just to get an understanding of the people we consulted back then when we started, we had to start with about 150 interviews. Those participants, people who are experts or leaders in the various sectors. So it was not intended to be a survey where numbers count, but we had to choose leaders in various sections of society. As you can see, even the sectors, I mean, we had people representing the judiciary, we had people representing labor unions, you know, people from the environmental sector, health, and so on. But we're also very mindful of the demographics of the country in terms of race, age, and gender. We had to be as close as possible to, you know, the makeup of South African society. And then from that, then we developed what we call variables. We had about 25 variables then. And this is just a screenshot of those variables. And I mean, I won't touch on every single one of them, maybe one or two that are very interesting, like number 5, overall inequality will remain high in South Africa. And another one that I like, number 15, the number of single parents or female-headed households will increase. So if you read through all the 25, I don't know if you have access to the booklet, you will see that it's different statements about the future looking towards 2030. Those were then ranked in terms of the impact, but also in terms of, you know, the uncertainty, because we're working with the future. So we had to look at all those 25 variables to establish the ones that we are most uncertain about, but will have also the biggest impact on us. And from there, we developed what we call key driving forces. That's like KDFs. We came up with 3 KDFs, and I think Tara might have touched on those, but those KDFs are, you know, a synthesis of the most impactful and variables, but those also we are not too sure about, and we had to conduct deeper research to get an understanding of those. The first one was social inequality, and built into that, it's not just inequality in terms of material forms or income inequality and so on, but it is rather, you can show all 3 of them. It is inequality in all its facets, whether it's gender inequality or whether it's inequality in terms of the provincial makeup. For example, if, you know, I grew up in the Eastern Cape, I'd have a different reality from someone who grew up in Gauteng province. And also in terms of access to networks. So it's all sorts of forms of inequality. So that's why we had to make sure we call it social inequality, because there's a tendency to misconstrue it to mean income inequality. Then there's the second one, which is institutional capacity and leadership. And again, this is also more nuanced. We're not speaking about the capacity of the state to run its affairs. But what we found through those variables, that the issue of leadership and capacity is also quite endemic in business, it's endemic in the whole of society. Whether you go to our churches, there's issues of ethical leadership there, there's a lack thereof rather. You go to our communities, unlike before, we would have street committees and whatnot, even down to the most basic unit of society, which is the family. We seem to be lacking in that as a nation. So, it's obvious then that the state would also, demonstrate such a lack of capacity. And as we all know, we've experienced that. And the last one being resistance, resentment, and reconciliation. Now, this one was quite contested because it was so loaded. I mean, there were variables here that spoke to the lack of common understanding of our history or where we come from, but also in terms of, the democratic transition itself, wherein young people, especially from that fallism movement or the fallist movement, were questioning the moment of transition, whether it was a moment of selling out. We've been hearing in some quarters where they even say Mandela himself was, a sellout because the realities have not changed. So there is this increasing resentment, which then goes against the idea of reconciliation. Pardon me. From those key driving forces, we then came up with storylines, which are the scenarios. Excuse me. The first scenario, I think I will start with Gwara so that, maybe by the time we finish with the storylines, we are not feeling as demoralized, because this is about a demoralized society, a nation that is torn between immobility and a restless energy. So now what happens in the Gwara nation? When the storyline begins, it starts from no consequences at what we imagined would have been a kind of trial, but as the years unfolded, that ended up to be like what now we observe as the Zondo Commission, where certain individuals who had been accused of corruption would have, had to be interrogated publicly. But then in this scenario, there's no consequences. And as a result, we see a further capture of key state institutions. We see municipalities forming their own shadow states. So again, this is something that we imagine and building to 2030. Now the Gwara nation ends in a total collapse of the state. And there's even a statement in that storyline that speaks of the fall of the nation. But then at the end of it, we see a woman who rises as a president, and it's imagined that someone will come from the youthful movements that have been emerging. So there is a positive end to the story, but then the ANC is ejected because of a very angry electorate. We see the ANC eventually going to the IMF, and now it's strangely enough, in that storyline, we saw this happening just before the 2024 elections, but we've seen the ANC government going to the IMF now during COVID. So what it means is that COVID intensified some of the key milestones that were identified for the storyline, and meaning that, this could, be the same across all the different storylines, what COVID happened. But we've seen that happen across the world where, issues that we're facing different societies seem to be amplified by the advent of COVID-19. The next storyline is the bourgeois. Now, this one is about a bourgeois nation. I mean, contained in it. Oh yeah, another thing, we used dance moves So these are popular dance moves. We use dance moves to name all these scenarios. So Gwara is a dance move. Isibhujwa is yet another dance move, but we're playing also around the wording of it, because this is supposed to actually be a reflection on a bourgeois nation where everything is market driven, and you see the elite becoming increasingly rich and the poor, even poorer. But also what is significant, there's a complete erosion of the middle class in this scenario. So it's either you're part of the elite or you're extremely poor and nothing in between. And we see society moving into enclaves. So it's called an enclave nation, wherein the social divides are even more deepened, and the rich can privatize everything from water to electricity. They're getting off the grid. They've got their own private security, living in private enclaves with shopping center, hospital, school. And we've started seeing that. I mean, in most of the suburbs, I live in Pretoria East, in Joburg, it would be the north, where we're seeing these enclaves or security estates. Whereas just on the other side of the world, you see an informal settlement, that is growing, where the poor live, but also the poor also create their own enclaves that also are as difficult to access as the security estates, and through, violent protest and so on. But also there is a sense of privatization there, where we see, especially early childhood development centers that emerge, run by, retired school teachers. So these eventually start even outperforming the public early childhood development center. So you see in these scenarios, it's a sense of, everyone for themselves, wherein those who understand terminology, like others would say, it's vukuzenzele. So you have to be self-sufficient, because it's all about a very cynical self-interest. And then the last one is Naila walk. So it's another dance move, but this dance move is not something that you can do alone. If Naila walk is similar, there's like in others would call it's like a square dance or Kodesa or whatever, but it's like the dance move that you can only do as a group. So it means like it requires, precise sequence of steps that you can all do. If you do this dance move alone, it looks a bit ridiculous, but if you're doing it as a group, and I'm sure like across the world, there's all those kinds of, dance moves, and what it's supposed to symbolize is that it's a nation that's in precise sequence of steps that are nicely choreographed towards a common vision. And here we see a South Africa that's growing, there's increasing social cohesion, but there's also economic expansion and a renewed sense of constitutionalism, wherein citizens are also rising up to support the constitution. Schools adopt, constitutionalism, it's part of the curriculum, and also citizens are able to hold, government accountable. But what's significant in this one also is that there's also still a reduced majority of, the ANC government, which makes it easier for society to keep holding it accountable. So those are the three scenarios that we've been working with. However, as mentioned, that some of the features of these scenarios have been intensified by COVID. And as a result, we are going through a process of renewing the scenarios. And that process is, the impetus being, the worst COVID. So right now we're at the beginning of starting again. We've started with the interviews. We have now new sets of variables. Unfortunately, we cannot share those because, they're still, I think, at draft level. We have not even developed the key driving forces, but we're being mindful of, things that have happened, and we've extended the horizon also. So we're moving from 2030 to 2035. So that is the process that's going to be taking place going forward, and hopefully next year we'll have a new set of scenarios. I think, Marius, that's it. And apologies for all the technical issues.
I wonder if I should come in there and re-invite Tara back in. Tara, thank you for your patience. What would be great? We have about 18 minutes left. I wonder, Tara, if you want to take 8 or 10 minutes of those to talk about the barometer's findings, and a little bit, if you want to weave in a little bit about how we are using that information and what the, what is all of this trying to achieve. And then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks, Xolelwa. So let me come back in with these slides. But basically, what we're looking at here is, there we go. Xolelwa mentioned the scenario. You'll see that the barometer is very much organized around these scenarios by taking 53 indicators that are each representative of these key driving forces that Xolelwa mentioned. So there's a whole technical scenario generation process around variable identification that Xolelwa mentioned. So a lot of these variables, then what we did is we turned them into measurable data indicators, found secondary data sources for almost all of these. So this is not a data generation process, it's a data compilation and interpretation and aggregation process. And then for each of these indicators and data points, determined cutoff points. So for example, under social inequality, you've got macroeconomic indicators like growth, right? Economic growth, GDP growth, classic. If South Africa has 6% or higher GDP growth, which is also the target in the National Development Plan, then we are in the Ngwato, the best case scenario for that indicator. If we are under 2% year-on-year growth, then we can't possibly afford the kinds of things that we need to be able to do as a society in the better case scenarios. So that would be the Ngwato scenario for that indicator. And if it's in between, then it's the bourgeois scenario. So basically the way in which the barometer is then structured is to say for each of these 53 indicators, where does each separate indicator fall in terms of which scenario it would be in? And then we can see overall where the scenarios fall. So what that looks like is, here's an example that shows the 2020 results and the 2021 results. We're going to be launching 2022 in July this year. So out of the resistance, resentment, and reconciliation indicators, so there's 11 of those, 12, I think, 50% last year were in the worst case scenario. So the green, it's a bit misleading, but green in this case is Ngwato. And I think only one was in the Ngwato best case scenario. What you can see is in the social inequality indicators, it's almost entirely worst case scenario. So what this does then is it does that I spoke about. So on the one hand, it gives you an overall picture. I'll show that just now, but it does allow you to say which parts of society, which dimensions of life are the ones where we have the deepest dilemmas, problems in the scenarios. And we can see it's really the everyday life of the everyday person. So the level of social inequality. And when you then put that together, you have a very simple visualization, very memorable, simple visualization that nonetheless compiles this into empirically saying, from 2019 through to last year, 3 iterations. This year we're doing the 4th. We can see that based on objective data sources, independent data sources, the country is moving more and more into the most negative scenario, and that quite a lot of the specific things that were predicted in 2017 have in fact happened. And so this then, that storytelling and that year-on-year tracking and that opportunities for media coverage, opportunities for workshops and presentations to senior decision makers. And I mean, I think as Marius was saying, what are we using this for? So Xolelwa and I and colleagues and Marius as well, other colleagues are working on this project, at least once a month, if not more often. We are invited to present to various forums. That includes recently the government forum of director generals. It includes forums of senior corporate leaders. We've been invited to present to various civil society organizations, various individual corporates who then want to use this as part of their own strategic thinking and planning work. So the idea very much is to enable linking conversations and the kind of compacting work that Marius is leading by providing a common language about where the country is and where the country should be going, where the country could be going, by providing a starting point of the current status. So again, to try and overcome that initial a sort of delay that happens when people are fighting about, is it really that bad? Or that's just today's newspaper articles, it's not the general story. You know, get beyond anecdotal evidence that you're bombarded with through the media to actually saying, here's an empirical long-term trend perspective that isn't just from one perspective, it's not just one sector's priorities, but that actually tries to bring together quite a large range of other perspectives. What we also do as part of this is a small perception survey. I'm not going to go into that because we don't have time. I'll leave it there. But I mean, essentially, this is the image that we try to get out there, along with this one that breaks down a bit more. Where is this problem coming from? What is actually the underlying problem? In the media, we constantly hear about corruption cases and politician this and politician that. And so it makes you feel like the malaise in the country is actually institutional capacity and leadership. But once you look at this, it shows you, well, yes, that's a big problem. But what's much deeper is that everyday challenge of how do I feed my children? Where is this month's electricity payment going to come from? Serious levels of educational kind of non-performance as a system and as a country. So these are things we all know, but when you put them in relation to a lot of these other things that are more in the media and more sort of newsworthy, it's so easy to forget them. And that's what really this is trying to do, a memorable overarching story, and then a breakdown that really focuses action and discussion. All right. Marius, I hope that didn't take up too much time. Back to you.
Thank you, Tara. That's absolutely perfect. And I'm going to make one quick input from my side before circling back with a closing question for each of you. To respond to the two questions in the chat from Michael saying, was there identification of policy measures by government that would help move towards the Nyale Walk? And what about the role of the private sector and society? And then Chantal saying, how are these conversations facilitated? So just to touch on that very quickly, Michael, one of the contributors to the project through ADRS's modeling is the former statistician general of the country, who would typically talk about what he calls the chronic crisis of low growth, high unemployment, poverty, and high inequality. And if you put that against the backdrop of the demographics, which is really about a youth bulge, an unemployed youth bulge, you then get into a policy discussion, which says, what is the policy package that is politically mobilizing at the party political level? It's socially desirable at the civil society stakeholder level, but economically feasible in terms of the economy you have as opposed to the economy you want. Now, I don't have time, of course, today to go into the detail, but a whole range of analysis was done to unpack the policy implications of certain choices. And maybe to summarize, what was arrived at was what's called a balanced growth approach, which is that certain interventions move the country up a certain level of the escalator in terms of achieving economic and socioeconomic outcomes. And eventually, the idea would be that those policy choices would translate into what we've described in the scenario work as in the foresight work here, as a social compacting process. So there's a sense in which what is needed at a national level is to move the country from a state of unproductive stalemate towards a state of productive forward movement, but that requires this middle part, which we describe as creative contestation. And so through social dialogue and social compacting, either at national level or at sectoral level or based on certain issues, you might be able to find sufficient consensus to move the policymakers and the decision makers and the actors in the ecosystem to begin to work together towards those goals. And so that's very ambitious, but that's the framing of that. What I'd like to do is to come back to Xolelwa and Tara, maybe with the same question, but for you to share from your perspective. So starting with Xolelwa, I know that you're in conversations with the National Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and there's an exploration of the possibility of working with the UNDP at a national level. How would you see the partnership with national government in its planning engine, or with the multilateral or other institution in the next phase of this kind of national foresight work? What would be the purpose of that and the benefit of that? And then maybe after you, Tara, if you want to come in on your current work on policy choices, it'd be really appreciated. Xolelwa.
I think as indicated by the questions
Sorry, Xolelwa, it seems like your network is breaking up. If you'd like to restart.
About government, is government now?
It's still very slow. If you want to mute your video and then restart, please.
Okay, yeah, maybe that could help. And now? Much
better. Please go ahead.
Much better. Okay, thank you so much. My internet is a bit dicey. Everything is wrong today. I mean, if you look at the questions that we got just from the participants here about policymakers and how they are responding to it, that's usually the question we get across all platforms. As we indicated, that we've traveled across the country, trying to communicate these scenarios. And we thought maybe it would be worth our while to have a closer engagement with government, even though we've already presented to them as well. And so far, those conversations are still at their infancy. But what we know is that if there's going to be an effort towards convening the nation, it has to be from the highest office. And already the solutions that Marius and his team are offering in terms of social compacting, I mean, that's something that the state is supposed to be leading, even though it's all sectors of the state. So that's our approach to it, to also communicate the message that everyone we've engaged with has always asked how they're responding. So it's a way to offer, to them answers to some of the challenges. It's up to them to take up the knowledge or even implement, but we're hoping going forward we will have a closer working relationship, because so far our partners have mainly been drawn from big business in particular, and it needs to start shifting. We need to see more of a presence of the state in terms of this work. We're not saying that we'll go ahead with it, but it's something that we're still negotiating with them. There's still some meetings that have to take place, and in particular when it comes to this new work of the 2035 scenarios. I think, that's it.
Thank you, Xolelwa. Very, very useful. Tara.
I think it's important to say that the original scenarios were in fact launched by President Ramaphosa when he just came into power, and that every single year since then we've had the annual Indlela Miti Day launched or headlined by the Chief Justice and by the Speaker of Parliament. So in that sense, very, very senior people, last year was a former president, from government, have been involved at the highest levels right from the beginning. So in addition to that, which recognizes the significance of the project and the awareness of government at highest levels of the project. What Xolelwa was mentioning now is trying to embed the project into the actual operational planning systems and accountability systems of the government, which is a much harder step than kind of getting somebody to headline an event for a day. In terms of that question around, connecting to policy, in addition to what Marius talked about, so the economic modeling, a lot of that work has been done at national level and has been presented in various places and is being discussed, but it is in fact being very directly implemented already at the provincial level in Gauteng, which is the economic powerhouse of the country. So there are already local government, municipal, metro government connections that are very concrete. The work side in a similar way to the economic side, although definitely not at as much depth, is to try and get exactly that same more of a modeling, the principles of how one would go about looking at the policy implications of some of these things, rather than saying, here is what you must do. What we're trying not to do as a whole project is to switch from being a sort of thinking partner to being an implementation consultant. That's not the frame that we want to operate in. And we all do that in our other parts of our professional lives. We know how that works as well. But this project is not supposed to be like that. But what we're trying to do is, for example, pick a few of the indicators that come out in the barometer that have just made the biggest moves over the last couple of years. Let's say nutrition, which has gone terribly wrong. The level of hunger in the country has just increased frightfully over the last several years. And to not just say, here's a problem, but to say, okay, would the 3 or 4 or 5 most recognized policy shifts need to be in order to move this particular indicator from where it is now to where we would want to see it at in the right scenario, in a good standard. Who would need to work together? What kind of investment would be needed? What kinds of activities have been empirically proven to work? And then we can say, here's a package, and this is how it exactly the political mobilization and the social desirability and the economic feasibility. And it's not going to be all 53 indicators, of course, they're proxies, but it'll be some examples of how to go about thinking what we could do or should do next. Okay, that's it for me.
Tara, thank you so much. Very, very useful. Colleagues, let me say in closing, if I step away from the project that you've just heard about, and in the context of our course, reflect on what is it that we just saw, I would put this in language slightly different from what Tara and Xolelwa have described, that essentially what is being done here is an exercise in using foresight for transformative societal discourse. And so if you followed that here in my last minute in closing, as a process, what essentially is being done is a process of facilitative societal leadership using foresight. So it starts with a key question, uses the variables and the scenarios and looks for the consequences of those scenarios. But under the surface, really what it's doing is it's surfacing the issues. It's creating a set of shared mental models, which Tara referred to as facilitating certain conversations that can create a shared point of view. And then there's an element of visioning within that of course leads to that third level down, where ideally one gets at the bottom right to a set of key policy or strategic choices, which of course influences then the public opinion and potentially the political process and moves the country forward, but not from the point of view of business or government or civil society, but as a collective societal process through that process of facilitative leadership. Let me stop there and say that I've really enjoyed having Tara and appreciated, Tara, your input, and Xolelwa, thank you for taking the time out to share with us. Colleagues, a reminder that we are preparing for our experiments clinic in about a week's time. So you may want to start work on your foresight experiment. The Q&A in the House Space platform is open. If you want to post a question, we will, of course, share the reading, the report, and any material from the session with you. Look forward to seeing you in our next session. Thanks again, Xolelwa and Tara. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.